See this scratched piece of faded blue plastic I am holding? To most people, it looks like something you would find at the bottom of a junk drawer or maybe stuck between the cushions of an old sofa. It is barely legible anymore, and the magnetic strip on the back is peeling off. But to my older sister, Ebony, this card looked like a joke, a final insult. Something to be flicked off her perfectly manicured fingernail and tossed into the mud. 10 years ago, she threw this in my face and told me it was a charity handout. She laughed when she said it was just enough to rent a ghetto apartment for a month so I could get out of her sight and out of her life. She had no idea that she was literally throwing away a fortune. And she definitely had no idea that this little piece of plastic was the reason I'm sitting here today in this penthouse overlooking the Buckhead skyline drinking a $500 bottle of Cabernet, while she is probably right now begging for an extra shift at a diner just to pay her rent. My name is Nia, and if you have ever been underestimated, treated like an outsider in your own family, or looked down on because you were adopted, you are going to want to hear this. Before I tell you how I bought my sister's debt and evicted her from her own dream house, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you believe that living well is the best revenge, or if you prefer a more direct approach like I do. Trust me, you are not going to believe what my parents were actually hiding in this card, and you definitely will not believe the look on my brother-in-law's face when he realized who his new landlord was. But to understand why holding this card feels better than winning the lottery, we have to go back to the worst day of my life. The day my parents were buried. It was a Tuesday in November, and the Atlanta sky was gray and weeping, matching the hollow feeling in my chest. I remember standing outside the historic Baptist church, shivering in a black coat that had seen better days. I tried to step under the large white canopy tent set up for the immediate family near the gravesite, but a hand shot out and blocked my path. It was Brad, my sister's husband. He looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes and adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Naya, honey, space is tight under here," he said, his voice dripping with that fake southern politeness that is worse than a curse word. "We need the front rows for the direct bloodline relatives. It looks better for the photos and the estate records. Why do not you go stand back there with the house staff? You know, with the people you are more comfortable with." I stood frozen rain mixing with the tears on my face, watching my sister Ebony sitting front and center. She was dabbing her dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief, but I could see her checking her watch, looking bored. That was the moment I realized I did not just lose my parents. I lost the only shield I had against the monsters who called themselves my family. The air inside the historic Baptist church was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive white lilies and old timber. It was the kind of funeral my parents would have wanted. Grand. Performative. Packed with Atlanta's elite who were there to be seen rather than to mourn. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows on the polished pews, but I felt nothing but a cold gray chill settling in my bones. I adjusted the collar of my simple black dress and began to walk down the center aisle toward the front row where the family seating was reserved with velvet ropes. I just wanted to be close to them one last time. Despite everything, they were the only parents I had ever known. But before I could cross the threshold of the VIP section, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was heavy and firm. I looked up to see Brad blocking my path. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that probably cost more than my entire year of rent, and his smile was tight and practiced. He did not move aside. Instead, he leaned down his cologne, smelling of expensive musk and condescension. "Nia, sweetie, you cannot sit here," he whispered loud enough for the nearby deacon to hear. "We reserved the first 2 rows for immediate family. You know, direct bloodline only. The photographer needs clear shots of the grieving heirs for the society pages, and we do not want to confuse the narrative." Confuse the narrative. That was his polite way of saying I was a mistake. A stain on the perfect biological legacy they wanted to project to the world. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as the whispers started behind me. I could feel the eyes of my parents' business partners and country club friends boring into my back. They knew I was adopted, but today Brad made sure they remembered I was second class. I did not make a scene. I never did back then because I was still desperate for their approval. I simply nodded, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron and turned around. I walked the long, humiliating path back past the rows of curious onlookers all the way to the very last pew near the drafty entrance doors. I slid into the hard wooden bench next to Mrs. Hattie, our housekeeper of 20 years. She was wearing her Sunday best and clutching a worn Bible. She was the only person in the room who actually looked devastated. She squeezed my hand, her rough palm against my trembling fingers, and that small act of kindness almost broke me. From my vantage point in the shadows, I had a perfect view of the performance happening at the altar. Ebony was center stage. She was draped in black designer silk, her head bowed in what looked like deep prayer. Every time the photographer raised his camera, she dabbed her dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. But between the hymns and the eulogies, I saw the truth. She was not praying. She was shifting impatiently in her seat, pulling back the sleeve of her dress to check her diamond watch. She checked it 3 times during the pastor's sermon. She was not mourning the loss of our parents. She was counting down the minutes until she could get out of here and get her hands on their assets. The drive back to the Buckhead estate was silent, but walking through the massive double doors felt like stepping into a stranger's house. This was the home where I learned to walk and where I had my first heartbreak. But today it felt cold and sterile. The air conditioning was cranked up too high, chilling the sweat on my back from the church. In the grand dining room, a lavish buffet had been set up. It was a traditional repast, but everything looked too perfect to be touched. Silver platters piled high with fried chicken, truffle mac and cheese, and collard greens sat under heating lamps, while waiters circulated with trays of crystal champagne flutes. My stomach gave a violent rumble. I had not eaten in 2 days, spending every waking moment at the hospital, or handling the funeral arrangements that Ebony could not be bothered with. I walked toward the buffet table feeling lightheaded. The smell of the spices was intoxicating. I reached out instinctively for a golden fried drumstick, just needing something to settle the shaking in my hands. Before my fingers could graze the crispy skin, a hand slapped my wrist away. It was sharp and stinging like a ruler in a strict classroom. I recoiled and looked up to see Ebony standing there, her eyes narrowing into slits. She did not look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a general commanding troops. "Do not eat with your hands," she hissed through gritted teeth. "You are acting like a starving animal. Look around you, Naya. This is not a family dinner. This is a reception for Brad's investors and the top real estate partners in the city. You are making us look trashy." I looked around the room. She was right. The room was filled with men in expensive suits and women holding designer clutches. They were not talking about my parents. They were talking about interest rates and property values. The sound of silver forks hitting fine china echoed around the room like tiny bells of judgment. I felt the heat rise in my neck. I was standing in my own house, the house my father paid for with 40 years of hard work, and I was being told I was not good enough to eat his food. "Use the tongs, or better yet, go find a corner and stay out of the way," Ebony muttered, wiping her hand on a napkin as if touching me had dirtied her. "Brad is trying to close a deal with the developer over by the fireplace. Do not ruin this for us with your lack of home training." She turned on her heel and glided away towards a group of wealthy mourners, instantly switching her scowl for a charming, tragic smile. I stood there paralyzed. The hunger in my stomach was replaced by a heavy lump in my throat. I did not take the chicken. Instead, I grabbed a glass of tap water and retreated to the far wall, standing next to a marble bust of my grandfather. I watched as strangers ate the food I grew up on and laughed in the home that was supposed to be my sanctuary. I realized then that the locks on the doors had not changed, but I had already been evicted from this family long before today. The heavy oak doors of my father's study clicked shut, sealing us inside with the scent of aged tobacco and leather. This room had always been the seat of power in our family, the place where my father built his empire and made decisions that shaped the skyline of Atlanta. Now it felt like a courtroom. Mr. Vance, our family attorney for 30 years, sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He looked smaller than I remembered. His hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, were trembling slightly as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and shuffled the thick stack of legal documents before him. He refused to make eye contact with me, focusing intently on the water stain on the leather blotter. Ebony sat on the edge of the Chesterfield sofa, clutching Brad's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. She was not holding on for comfort. She was holding on for the payout. She had already mentally spent the inheritance before we even walked through the door. Vance cleared his throat and began to read in a monotone voice that seemed to suck the air out of the room. To my eldest daughter Ebony, he began, I leave the entirety of the Buckhead estate, including all furnishings and art. I also bequeath the vacation home in the Hamptons, the fleet of vehicles, and the controlling interest in the construction firm, along with the primary investment portfolio. The silence was shattered by a loud smack as Brad slammed his palm onto the coffee table, making the crystal coaster jump. Yes, he shouted, jumping up and pacing the room like he had just scored a touchdown instead of inheriting money he did not earn. I knew it. I knew they would do the right thing. He turned to look at me, a smug grin stretching across his face that made my stomach turn. See, Nia, Mom and Dad were always fair people. They understood the natural order of things. Blood is thicker than water. Legacy has to stay with the real family. Mr. Vance flinched at Brad's outburst. He finally looked over the rim of his glasses at me, his eyes filled with a profound apology that his professional ethics would not let him speak aloud. He knew this was cruel. He knew I had been the one driving Dad to chemo appointments while Ebony was partying in Miami. He knew I was the one who managed their medical bills while Brad was trying to borrow money from them. But he was bound by the ink on the page. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I had prepared myself for this. I knew that in their eyes, my adoption papers were just a contract that expired the moment my parents took their last breath. Ebony was already pulling out her phone, probably to list the house for sale or book a first-class flight. She did not even say thank you to the man reading her parents' final wishes. Mr. Vance cleared his throat again, louder this time, to cut through their premature celebration. I am not finished, he said, his voice shaking just a little. There is one final item. A personal bequest for Nia. Mr. Vance reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a single plain white envelope. It was thin and unsealed. There was no weight to it, no promise of property deeds or stock certificates inside. He extended his hand across the mahogany desk, intending to pass it to me with some semblance of dignity, but he never got the chance. Ebony moved with the speed of a predator. She snatched the envelope from the air before I could even lift my hand. Let us see what the charity case gets, she sneered, tearing the paper open without a second of hesitation. She pulled out a folded piece of stationery and a generic blue debit card attached to a bank brochure. She tossed the letter aside without even glancing at it, focusing entirely on the card. She scanned the terms written on the back, and then a sound erupted from her throat that made my blood run cold. It was a laugh. A cruel, high-pitched cackle that bounced off the book-lined walls. Oh my God, Brad! Look at this, she gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. $2,000. That is it. That is the grand inheritance. She turned to me, waving the card like it was a cheap coupon. Mom and Dad really had a twisted sense of humor in the end. This is basically bus fare, Nia. Or maybe just enough for a security deposit on one of those roach-infested studio apartments in East Point. You know, the kind of place where you actually belong. I sat frozen in my chair. The insult was not just about the money, it was the confirmation that in their eyes, I was worth less than the handbag sitting at her feet. Brad chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at the paperwork for the multi-million-dollar estate he had just married into. Well, it is better than nothing, he said with a shrug. Though I would not count on that lasting long with inflation. Ebony did not hand the card to me. She looked at me with pure disgust, flicked her wrist, and sent the blue plastic rectangle spinning through the air. It hit my cheek with a sharp sting before clattering onto the polished hardwood floor. The sound was tiny and pathetic, echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "Pick it up," she commanded, leaning back into the leather sofa like a queen addressing a peasant. "Go on, Nia. You need every penny. Do not let your pride make you starve." Mr. Vance looked down at his desk, unable to watch. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a drumbeat of pure rage, but I pushed it down. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling heavy as lead. I knelt on the floor in my morning dress. I lowered myself at my sister's feet to retrieve the scraps she had thrown at me. The floor was cold against my knees. I reached out and grabbed the card, my fingers brushing against the dust of the rug. I felt small. I felt microscopic. As I stood up, clutching the plastic that represented my parents' final valuation of my life, I looked at Ebony. She was not even looking at me anymore. She was already pointing at the estate deed, asking Mr. Vance how quickly they could liquidate the assets. I was dismissed. I was erased. But as I squeezed that card in my fist, I made a silent vow that this was the last time I would ever kneel before anyone in this family again. The heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open, but not to welcome me home. They opened just wide enough for Brad to drag my battered Samsonite suitcase onto the driveway. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a true Georgia thunderstorm that turned the world into a blur of gray and black. I stood on the sidewalk, shivering in my soaked funeral dress, waiting for him to hand me my bag. Instead, he swung it by the handle like a hammer thrower and launched it into the air with a grunt of effort. It hit the wet asphalt with a sickening crack. The zipper, already strained from years of use, gave way instantly. My clothes, my few books, and the framed photo of my parents, the only one I dared to take, spilled out into the muddy gutter. A silk blouse my mother gave me for my 25th birthday was instantly soaked in dirty runoff water, turning from cream to a stained brown. My toiletries bag burst open, sending shampoo and toothpaste oozing onto the street. Brad stood under the shelter of the brick gatehouse, dry and smug. He wiped his hands on his dress pants as if he had just finished taking out the trash. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, like I was a stray dog that refused to leave the porch. "You have $2,000 now, Nia," he shouted, his voice cutting through the sound of the thunder. "Do not be a mooch anymore. Get lost so I can change the locks. We do not want strangers coming back around here interrupting our grieving process." He did not wait for a response. He hit the button on the keypad, and the wrought iron gates began to swing shut with a final metallic clang. I heard the electronic deadbolt slide into place, sealing my past away from my future. I looked down at my life scattered on the pavement. A younger version of me would have fallen to her knees and begged. A younger version of me would have cried and asked why I was not good enough, why my sister hated me so much. But as the freezing rain plastered my hair to my face, something inside me snapped. It was not a break. It was a hardening, like molten steel being quenched in ice water. The tears that had been threatening to fall since the church service evaporated. I looked up at the house one last time. Through the storm, I could see the lights of the mansion glowing warm and golden in the distance. I could see the silhouette of Ebony in the living room window, holding a glass of wine, watching. She was not looking away. She wanted to see this. She wanted to savor the sight of her little sister picking through the mud. I did not scramble to pick up everything. I left the ruined blouse. I left the heavy textbooks. I only grabbed the absolute essentials and stuffed them back into the broken bag, holding it together with my arm. I shoved the blue debit card deep into my pocket, ensuring it was safe. My fingers curled around it tightly. It was cold and hard against my skin. It was no longer just money. It was the only weapon I had left. I looked at the closed gate one last time. I did not scream. I did not curse. I just stared at the family crest on the metal bars, with eyes that were colder than the storm. I memorized this feeling of absolute rock bottom. I etched the image of my sister's silhouette into my mind, because I knew that the next time I stood at these gates, I would not be on the outside looking in. I turned my back on the only home I had ever known and began the long walk toward the bus stop, the sound of my broken suitcase wheels dragging against the pavement, marking the first beat of my new life. The neon sign outside the motel room window buzzed with the persistent, angry sound of a dying insect flashing a harsh pink light that cut through the thin curtains every 3 seconds. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner, a scent that stuck to the back of my throat and made me want to gag. I sat on the edge of the mattress, which dipped heavily in the middle under my weight, and looked around at my new reality. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing layers of brown rot underneath, and the carpet was sticky with secrets I did not want to know. Just 3 hours ago, I was standing on Persian rugs in a climate-controlled mansion. Now, I was sitting in a $29 a night box in East Point, listening to a couple screaming at each other in the room next door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the blue debit card. In the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom, it looked even cheaper than it had in my father's study. $2,000. That was the price tag my parents had put on my childhood. That was the severance package for 22 years of being the dutiful daughter. I felt a surge of hot bile rise in my chest. My fingers tightened around the plastic, bending it until it turned white at the stress point. I wanted to snap it in half. I wanted to shred it into a million tiny pieces and flush it down the stained toilet. I wanted to erase every trace of their pity and their insults. I applied more pressure, ready to hear the satisfying crack, but then I stopped. Outside the window, a police siren wailed, passing so close that the vibrations rattled the glass in the frame. The sound was sharp and urgent, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that used to blanket the Buckhead estate at night. In that house, the only sound you heard after dark was the hum of the expensive refrigerator or the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Here, the world was loud and dangerous. I relaxed my grip on the card. Destroying it would be easy, but it would also be foolish. Ebony and Brad expected me to fail. They expected me to burn through this money in a month and come crawling back to beg for scraps, or worse, to see me on the street. If I destroyed this card, I was just throwing a tantrum. If I kept it, I was keeping a receipt. I reached for my battered suitcase, which was sitting open on the floor like a wound. I dug through the mess of clothes until I found an old shoebox I used to store my sketchbooks. I emptied the books out onto the bed and placed the card face down at the very bottom of the box. I covered it with my drawings, burying it under layers of graphite and charcoal. "I will not touch this," I whispered to the empty room, my voice sounding raspy and foreign to my own ears. "I will not give them the satisfaction of knowing I needed their charity. I am going to survive this. I am going to climb out of this hole, and I am going to do it without spending a single cent of their blood money." I lay back on the lumpy pillows, staring up at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country that did not exist. The siren faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of distant traffic and the beating of my own heart. I was terrified. I was alone. But as I closed my eyes, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The worst had already happened. They had taken my home, they had taken my family, and they had tried to take my dignity. But they had failed to take my fight. I fell asleep to the rhythm of the flashing neon signs, swearing that the next time I saw my sister, I would be the one holding the keys. While I was learning how to survive in a room that smelled of mildew and despair, my childhood home was undergoing a violent transformation. The morning sun over Buckhead usually illuminated the dew on the manicured lawns, but today the air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and the deafening roar of heavy machinery. A massive yellow excavator sat in the middle of the backyard, its metal tracks digging deep ruts into the emerald green grass that my father had paid a landscaping crew thousands of dollars a year to maintain. But the target of this mechanical beast was not the grass, it was the rose garden. My mother had spent 30 years cultivating that garden. It was her sanctuary. She had prize-winning hybrid teas and climbing roses that smelled like heaven in late May. Every bush had a story, and every bloom was a labor of love that she used to tend to with her own hands, even when she could have hired someone else to do it. To Ebony, however, this vibrant living testament to our mother was nothing more than clutter that stood in the way of her vanity. She stood on the limestone terrace wearing a white silk caftan and oversized sunglasses, holding a mimosa, despite it being a Tuesday morning. She pointed a manicured finger at the center of the garden, where my mother's favorite bush, a rare grandiflora, called the Queen Elizabeth, was just beginning to bud. "Get rid of it all!" she shouted over the noise of the engine, her voice sharp and commanding. "I want every single one of these old-fashioned eyesores gone by lunch. It smells like a funeral home back here, and I am sick of looking at it." Brad was standing next to her, holding a rolled-up set of blueprints. He looked nervous but excited the way a gambler looks when he thinks he is about to hit the jackpot. He unrolled the paper, showing a rendering of a sleek, modern backyard that looked like it belonged in a Miami hotel, not a historic Georgia estate. "Are you sure about the infinity pool going right here, babe?" he asked, tapping the paper. "The grading is going to be expensive. We might have to take out a second mortgage on the equity, just to cover the concrete work." Ebony laughed, a sound that lacked any real warmth. "Do not be so cheap, Brad. This is an investment. Imagine the parties we are going to host. Imagine the Instagram photos. This house needs to reflect us, not two dead people who did not know how to live." She turned to him, posing with her hand on her hip. "Besides, do I not have the best taste? Tell me you can see the vision." Brad looked at the garden, then back at his wife. He saw the dollar signs. He saw the status. He did not see the history being erased. "You are a genius, baby," he said, kissing her cheek. "It is going to be the envy of the entire neighborhood." Ebony turned back to the construction crew and waved her hand dismissively, giving the signal to destroy. The operator pulled the lever and the metal bucket of the excavator swung down with a terrifying force. It smashed into the Queen Elizabeth bush, snapping the thick, ancient roots with a sound like a gunshot. The machine dragged the bush backward, tearing it from the earth it had called home for decades. As the bucket lifted the debris into the air, a shower of red petals rained down onto the muddy ground. They looked like drops of blood against the dark soil. The heavy metal tracks of the excavator rolled forward, crushing the fallen petals into a formless paste. Ebony took a sip of her drink and smiled, watching the destruction of our mother's memory with the satisfaction of a conqueror. She did not see a garden dying. She only saw the empty space where she could finally build a shrine to herself. The transition from being the daughter of a real estate mogul to being a nameless applicant in the Atlanta job market was a violent wake-up call. I quickly learned that my magna cum laude degree and my pristine GPA meant nothing without the right last name attached to them. For 3 weeks, I pounded the pavement in the sweltering Georgia heat. I wore my one remaining good suit, the charcoal gray blazer I had managed to salvage from the driveway. I steamed it every morning in the motel bathroom shower, hoping the humidity would hide the fact that it was the only professional thing I owned. My morning commute was no longer a comfortable drive in a luxury sedan. It was a 40-minute bus ride followed by a half-mile walk to the financial district. My black pumps, the ones I used to wear to gala dinners, began to betray me. The rubber tip on the left heel had worn down to the metal nail. Every step I took on the marble floors of those high-rise corporate lobbies made a sharp clicking sound. Click, click, click. A metronome counting down the days until my money ran out. I learned to walk on the ball of my foot, straining my calf muscles, just to silence the sound of my poverty. I sat in glass-walled conference rooms across from hiring managers who smelled like expensive coffee and indifference. They would scan my resume, their eyes lighting up at my academic awards, but then the inevitable question would come. "So Nia, tell us about your connections. Who referred you to our firm?" In this town, especially in the tight-knit world of high finance, capability was secondary to pedigree. They wanted to know who my father was. They wanted to know which country club my family belonged to. I could have dropped my father's name. I could have said I was a Wilson from Buckhead. But I knew the moment they made a call to verify Ebony or Brad would poison the well. So I swallowed my pride and said I was self-made. I saw the light fade from their eyes. "We are looking for someone with a more established network." One interviewer told me closing my folder. We need people who can bring in clients, not just crunch numbers. Lunch became a daily calculation of survival. I avoided the salads and artisanal sandwiches my fellow candidates ate. Instead, I found a bakery near the train station that sold day-old baguette ends for 50 cents. I would sit on a park bench watching the pigeons fight for crumbs, realizing I was not much different from them. I ate the stale bread, washing it down with water from a public fountain, telling myself it was fuel, not food. Rejection emails started filling my inbox. Thank you for your interest. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. Each notification was a blow to the chest, but I refused to let them see me bleed. I would go back to my motel room, polish my scuffed shoes with a black marker I found in a drawer, and iron my shirt for the next day. I was tired. I was hungry. But I was not broken. I knew I only needed one yes. I just needed one person to look at my brain instead of my shoes. I needed a door to open just a crack, and I swore I would kick it down. The reception area of Davis and Miller Associates did not have the floor-to-ceiling windows or the imported Italian marble of the firms that had rejected me earlier in the week. The carpet was a sensible shade of beige that had seen better decades, and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. It was a mid-sized firm, the kind that handled payroll for local factories and tax returns for small business owners. It was not glamorous, but it was a lifeline. I sat across from Mr. Henderson, a senior partner, who looked like he had not slept since the last fiscal quarter ended. He rubbed his temples while scanning my resume, his eyes glazing over the high GPA and the academic honors. I knew what was coming. The polite dismissal. The speech about how they were looking for someone with more practical experience, or someone who would be a better cultural fit. I gripped the armrests of the chair, my knuckles turning white. I could not go back to the motel without a job. I had $12 left in my wallet, and my room was paid up only until tomorrow morning. Mr. Henderson sighed and closed my folder. Look, Nia, you are obviously bright on paper, but auditing is not just about theory, it is about instinct. It is about seeing the story behind the numbers. We need someone who can hit the ground running, not someone we have to babysit. Desperation has a way of sharpening your senses. I noticed a stack of spreadsheets sitting on the corner of his desk. The red marker lines on the top page were aggressive and chaotic. Give me a chance to prove it, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Give me a test, any file you are stuck on. If I cannot find something your team missed in 5 minutes, I will walk out and never bother you again. Henderson paused, his hand hovering over his coffee mug. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. He saw the scuffed shoes and the slightly oversized blazer, but he also saw the hunger in my eyes. He chuckled, a dry sound devoid of humor, and slid the stack of papers across the desk. You have 5 minutes, he said, checking his watch. This is a preliminary audit for a logistics client. My junior associates say the numbers balance, but the cash flow is bleeding out somewhere. Find the leak. I pulled the papers toward me. The world around me faded away. The hum of the photocopier and the chatter of the secretaries disappeared. There was only the grid of numbers. I traced the columns with my finger. Revenue, cost of goods sold, operating expenses. It looked normal at a glance, but then I saw it. A pattern in the vendor payments. A recurring invoice for maintenance services that appeared every third Friday of the month. The amount varied slightly to avoid detection, but it was always just under the threshold that required a manager's approval signature. I did not need 5 minutes. I needed 2. Here, I said, pointing to row 42. You have a phantom vendor. These maintenance fees are being paid to a shell company. Cross-reference the tax ID number with your payroll. I bet you will find it matches one of the warehouse managers. Henderson snatched the paper back. He pulled a calculator from his drawer and started punching in numbers. His eyebrows shot up. He grabbed his phone and dialed an extension. Get me the payroll file for the logistics account. Now. He hung up and looked at me. The exhaustion in his face was replaced by a flicker of respect. "I cannot offer you an associate position," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We do not have the budget for a full hire right now. But I can bring you on as a probationary intern. Minimum wage, no benefits. You will be scanning documents and fetching coffee half the time." "I will take it," I answered before he could finish. He nodded slowly. "You start Monday. Do not be late." I walked out of that beige office building into the humid Atlanta afternoon. I did not have a salary that would buy a penthouse or a luxury car. I was making barely enough to afford a studio apartment and ramen noodles. But as I walked to the bus stop, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had a foot in the door. And for a woman with a secret fortune buried in a shoebox and a vendetta burning in her heart, a foot in the door was all I needed to tear the whole house down. While I was learning the art of forensic accounting by day and eating instant noodles by night, my sister was busy curating a masterpiece of deception on social media. Her Instagram feed became a window into a life that looked flawless from the outside. Every morning I would scroll through her stories from a burner account, watching her broadcast her so-called success to the world. There were photos of her sipping espresso in Milan, captioned with hashtags like Black Excellence and Generational Wealth. There were videos of her unboxing Louboutins in the foyer of the mansion, treating luxury goods like they were groceries. The crown jewel of her digital charade appeared on a Tuesday. It was a $20,000 Hermes Birkin bag in crocodile skin. She posted a video spinning around in her walk-in closet, clutching the orange box like it was a newborn baby. "Look what Brad got me for being the best wife ever," she cooed into the camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are just so blessed to live this life." The comments section was flooded with heart emojis and envy. People called them a power couple. They called her a queen. But the camera never panned down to show the reality happening just outside the frame. Down in the study, the room where my father used to carefully balance his ledgers, Brad was drowning. The mahogany desk was covered in envelopes stamped with angry red ink. "Past due. Final notice. Immediate action required." He was not closing real estate deals. He was playing a dangerous shell game with credit cards. He would open a new Platinum Amex to pay off the gold Visa and then take out a high-interest personal loan to cover the minimum payment on the Amex. I watched the scene play out in my mind as if I were a fly on the wall because I knew the numbers. I knew that the construction company stocks were tanking and the maintenance on a 10,000 square foot estate was bleeding them dry. Brad sat there wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand, staring at a bank statement that showed a balance of negative $4,000. The door to the study burst open and Ebony waltzed in swinging her new $20,000 bag. "Brad, hurry up," she chirped, not even noticing the pile of bills he frantically tried to cover with his arm. "The lighting in the garden is perfect right now. I need you to take a picture of me with the new car. We need to keep the engagement up." Brad looked at her, his eyes bloodshot. "Ebony, we need to talk about the spending," he said, his voice weak. "The property tax bill came today and I do not think we have enough liquid cash to cover it until the next flip closes. Maybe we should return the bag." Ebony stopped dead in her tracks. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Return it?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "Are you insane? Do you want people to think we are broke? Do you want Nia to see us struggling?" "Image is currency, Brad. If we look rich, we get rich. Now put those depressing papers away and come take my picture." Brad hesitated for a second, looking at the mountain of debt that was about to crush them. Then he sighed the sigh of a defeated man. He shoved the overdue notices into the bottom drawer of the desk, locking them away in the dark. He stood up, put on his fake smile, and followed her out to the garden. I watched the photo go live 10 minutes later. It got 2,000 likes in the first hour. I sat in my small cubicle staring at the screen, and for the first time I did not feel anger. I felt anticipation, because in my line of work I knew one universal truth. You can lie to your followers and you can lie to your spouse, but you can never lie to the math. And the math was coming for them. 3 years had passed since the night I was thrown out into the rain, and time had been kind to me in ways it clearly had not been to Brad. I was standing in the wine aisle of Whole Foods in Midtown, treating myself to a bottle of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon to celebrate my promotion to senior auditor. I was no longer the girl in the ill-fitting funeral dress. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that fit like armor, and my heels were Italian leather that clicked with authority against the polished floor. I reached for the bottle on the top shelf, my movements sharp and confident when a familiar and unwelcome voice cut through the ambient jazz music. "Well, look who they allow in here these days." I froze for a heartbeat before turning slowly. Brad stood there holding a basket that contained a frozen pizza and a six-pack of cheap beer. He still wore the trappings of wealth like a branded polo shirt and loafs, but up close the cracks were visible. His hairline was receding faster than his bank account, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could cure. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my suit with a mixture of confusion and contempt. "I see you cleaned up a bit, Nia," he sneered, stepping into my personal space. "What are you doing here?" "Spending the last few cents of that charity card Mom and Dad threw at you. Or maybe you finally found yourself a sugar daddy to pay the bills. I always knew you would end up using your assets one way or another, since you never had the brains for business." He laughed at his own joke, a wet, unpleasant sound. I felt a flash of the old anger, the heat that used to rise in my cheeks when they belittled me, but I suffocated it instantly. I did not owe him an explanation. I did not owe him a defense. I looked at him with eyes as dead as a shark's, looking right through him, as if he were a smudge on a window pane. I turned back to the shelf, grabbed the $80 bottle of wine, and walked calmly toward the checkout counter. Brad followed me, his ego bruised by my silence. "Hey, I am talking to you," he snapped, trailing behind me like a petulant child. "Do not think you are better than us just because you bought a new outfit. You are still the charity case. You are still the girl who needs handouts." I placed the bottle on the counter. The cashier scanned it and announced the total. Brad stood close behind me, watching intently, waiting for me to fumble. He wanted me to pull out a crumpled wad of cash, or that battered blue debit card. He wanted to see me struggle so he could feel superior about his own crumbling life. Instead, I reached into my leather purse and withdrew my wallet. With a smooth, practiced motion, I slid out my heavy silver Amex Platinum card. The metal clinked softly against the card reader. It was the sound of hard work. It was the sound of 80-hour weeks and sleepless nights. It was the sound of success that belonged only to me. Approved. The machine beeped cheerfully. I took the receipt and the bag. I turned to leave and finally locked eyes with Brad. His mouth was slightly open, his gaze fixed on the platinum card in my hand. For the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. He realized in that moment that the dynamic had shifted. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing against his arm, and I did not look back. I left him standing there with his frozen pizza and his jealousy looking very small in a very big world. Desperation has a distinct smell. It is a mix of stale coffee, cold sweat, and the ozone tang of an overheating laptop. In the darkened study of the Buckhead estate, Brad sat bathed in the harsh blue glow of 3 monitors. The mahogany desk, which had once been the command center for my father's legitimate business empire, was now scattered with sticky notes scribbled with passwords and wallet keys. Brad had stopped trying to earn money the hard way. He had convinced himself that he was just one smart play away from fixing everything. He listened to the whispers of his college buddies at the country club barmen who drove leased Ferraris and talked about decentralized finance as if it were a religion. They told him he was missing out. They told him that traditional real estate was for dinosaurs. So he went all in. He took out a home equity line of credit against the mansion, forging Ebony's signature on the paperwork because she was too busy planning her next gala to read documents. He poured 6 figures into a new cryptocurrency called Titan Coin that promised yield returns of 4,000%. He also bought land, not physical land in Georgia, that he could touch and develop, but digital plots of land in a virtual metaverse project that claimed to be the future of luxury living. He bought 3 invisible penthouses for the price of a real one, convinced that by next quarter, he would flip them for triple the value. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday when the reality set in. Brad sat in his expensive ergonomic chair watching the charts live. For weeks, the line had been green, creeping upward, fueling his delusions of grandeur. But tonight, the line had turned red. A deep, violent red that pointed straight down like a falling knife. The developers of Titan Coin had vanished, their website was down, their Twitter account was deleted. The chat rooms were flooded with people screaming about a rug pull. Brad hit the refresh button. His finger mashed the F5 key so hard the plastic cap flew off. The screen flickered and reloaded. The value of his portfolio, which had sat at $300,000 just yesterday, was now showing $12.50. He felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him lightheaded and nauseous. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and dripped onto the silk cuff of his shirt. The air conditioning in the house was set to 68 degrees, but Brad was burning up. He loosened his tie, gasping for air, as if the room was running out of oxygen. He clicked over to the real estate tab, praying that his digital penthouses were safe. The server timed out. Error 404. The virtual world had been shut down by the SEC for securities fraud. He sat back in his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent house. Upstairs, Ebony was sleeping soundly, dreaming of the new pool she wanted to install. She had no idea that the money for the pool, the money for the mortgage, and the money for the property taxes had just evaporated into the digital ether. Brad covered his face with his hands. He could hear the hum of the hard drive spinning, trying to process data that no longer existed. He had not just lost money. He had bet the house on a ghost story, and the ghost had just walked away with everything. 5 years is a lifetime when you are rebuilding yourself from scratch. The girl who used to eat stale baguette ends on a park bench was gone, replaced by a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms across Atlanta. I sat in my corner office on the 32nd floor, the city sprawl beneath me, looking like a circuit board of lights and concrete. My nameplate on the frosted glass door read, Nia Wilson, Senior Lead Auditor. It was not just a title, it was a fortress I had built brick by brick, with sleepless nights and unyielding precision. I swiveled my ergonomic chair toward the dual monitors where a Zillow listing was open. It was a sleek, modern 2-bedroom condo in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a concierge service. The price tag was steep, nearly $500,000, but for the first time in my life, I did not have to cringe at the number. I had the down payment sitting in my savings account earning interest. I had a credit score that was near perfect. I had done this. Me. The charity case. The mistake. I picked up my phone and dialed the real estate agent. I want to put in an offer. I said, my voice steady and assured. Full asking price, but I want a 30-day closing. As I hung up, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not excitement exactly. It was peace. For 5 years, I had been running fueled by the high-octane gasoline of rage and the need to prove them wrong. But looking at that condo listing, knowing I was about to buy a home with money I earned solely through my own sweat, I realized the fire had cooled. I did not need Ebony's approval. I did not need Brad's respect. I had surpassed them not because of who my parents were, but because of who I was. I walked over to the window and looked toward Buckhead, where the family estate sat nestled among the trees. In the beginning, I used to look in that direction and feel a sharp phantom pain like a missing limb. Now it was just a smudge on the horizon. I had heard rumors, of course. Atlanta is a small town for the wealthy. I heard whispers that Brad was leveraging heavily, that Ebony was firing staff left and right. But I pushed those thoughts away. They were ghosts. I was living among the living. I went back to my desk and opened my calendar. I had a meeting with the CFO of a logistics firm in 20 minutes. My life was full. My life was mine. I reached into my purse to grab a pen, and my fingers brushed against something cold and hard at the bottom. I froze. I had forgotten it was there. I had transferred purses a dozen times over the years, but somehow I always moved that old shoebox from apartment to apartment and eventually tucked the contents into a safe place. I had not looked at the blue debit card in years. I told myself I kept it as a souvenir, a reminder of where I came from. But standing there in my expensive suit in my expensive office, I realized I did not need reminders anymore. I was ready to let go. I was ready to fully sever the last thread that tied me to the people who threw me away. Tonight I decided I would finally cut that card into pieces and throw it in the trash where it belonged. The packing tape made a loud ripping sound that echoed in my nearly empty office. It was a sound of finality, a sound of moving on. I had spent the last 6 hours organizing 5 years of hard work into neat cardboard boxes. The movers were coming in the morning to transport my life to the new condo in Midtown. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment, but as I reached for the top shelf of the closet, my hand brushed against something that was not on the inventory list. It was an old Nike shoebox tattered at the corners and covered in a thick layer of gray dust. I pulled it down, coughing slightly as the particles danced in the afternoon sunlight. I knew exactly what was inside before I even lifted the lid. This was the only relic I had kept from the bad years. The years of motel rooms and instant noodles. I sat down on the floor, my legs crossed, and opened it. Inside, buried under a stack of charcoal sketches I drew when I was too poor to buy paint, was the blue debit card. It looked innocent enough. Just a piece of plastic with a magnetic strip. But looking at it now, I did not feel the anger I used to feel. I did not feel the sting of Ebony's laughter or the cold rain on my face from that night at the gate. I just felt tired. It was a heavy anchor dragging behind a ship that was trying to sail. I picked it up. The expiration date was long past. It was probably inactive, useless, just a piece of trash. But it represented a tie to them. A tie to the people who treated me like a line item to be deleted. I realized that bringing this box into my new home would be like bringing a ghost. I did not want their bad energy in my new sanctuary. I need to kill this, I said out loud, the words feeling right in the empty room. I grabbed my purse and checked the time. The bank branch, the small community bank listed on the back of the card, closed in an hour. It was on the way to the new condo. I would stop there. I would close the account formally. I would take that $2,000, that pity money they threw at me, and I would drive it straight to the St. Mary's Home for Children. I would give it to kids who actually needed it, kids who knew what it felt like to be unwanted. It would be a poetic end. I would turn their insult into someone else's blessing. I tossed the card into my purse, right next to my platinum Amex. The contrast made me smile. One represented my worth in their eyes. The other represented my worth in reality. I taped up the final box, wrote living room on the side with a thick black marker, and walked out the door. I felt lighter. I thought I was just running an errand to close an old account. I had no idea I was driving straight toward a detonation that would blow the past 10 years wide open. The automatic doors of First National Bank slid open with a whisper. This building used to be the Main Street Community Trust, where my father knew the branch manager by name, and where lollipops were handed out to kids on Fridays. Now it was a sterile fortress of glass and brushed steel, owned by a multinational conglomerate. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that felt designed to discourage loitering. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder, feeling the weight of the old blue card inside like a stone. I was not here to bank. I was here to exorcise a ghost. I joined the queue, standing behind a man depositing a stack of checks for his landscaping business. When it was finally my turn, I approached the teller station. The young man behind the glass had a name tag that read, Tyler. He had the bored, glazed-over look of someone who had spent too many hours explaining overdraft fees to angry customers. He did not greet me. He just raised his eyebrows in a silent prompt for me to state my business. I need to close an account, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I reached into my bag and retrieved the battered card, sliding it under the glass partition. Tyler picked it up with 2 fingers, holding it away from him as if it were a dirty tissue. He squinted at the faded logo and the peeling laminate. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Wow," he said, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "This thing is from the prehistoric era, lady. We stopped issuing these blue debit cards like 10 years ago." "I know how old it is," I replied, my patience already thinning. "I just want to withdraw the remaining balance and close it out." Tyler shook his head, typing lazily onto his keyboard. He did not even look at the card number yet. He was making assumptions based on the condition of the plastic. "Look, I am going to be honest with you. Accounts this inactive usually get eaten up by maintenance fees. If the balance dropped below the minimum 5 years ago, the system probably auto-closed it. You are likely standing here for a balance of $0.00. I felt a flicker of irritation. Not because I cared about the money, but because of the assumption that I was wasting his time. He saw a beat-up card and assumed a broke customer. He did not see the platinum watch on my wrist or the quality of my suit. "There should be around $2,000 in it," I said firmly. "Unless your bank has stolen it in fees. Just swipe the card, Tyler." He rolled his eyes openly now, a gesture that would have gotten him fired in my office. "Fine," he sighed, "but do not get your hopes up." He took the card and ran it through the magnetic reader attached to his monitor. The first swipe failed. He huffed and swiped it again, harder this time, aggressive enough to almost snap the brittle plastic. The computer screen in front of him blinked. For a second, nothing happened. Then a loud, jarring tone echoed through the silent lobby. It was not the soft beep of a transaction approval. It was a harsh, urgent alert that sounded like a security breach. Tyler froze. The smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of genuine confusion. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He hit a few keys, trying to clear the alert, but the computer was locked. "What is going on?" I asked, stepping closer to the glass. "I do not know." He stammered, his voice suddenly sounding very young and very scared. "It says, Code Red." I have never seen a code red before. The crimson banner pulsing on the computer monitor cast a harsh, demonic glow over Tyler's pale face. It was not a subtle notification. It was a full-screen lockdown that completely froze his terminal. The words, "Restricted Access Level 5 Security" flashed in bold white letters against the red background. The rhythmic pulsing of the alert on the screen seemed to sync with the sudden, terrified, rapid beating of the teller's heart. He pulled his hands away from the keyboard as if the keys had suddenly become red-hot. The arrogance he had displayed just seconds ago evaporated instantly, leaving behind a young man who looked like he had just accidentally triggered a nuclear launch sequence. I stared at the screen through the glass partition, my confusion morphing into a sharp spike of adrenaline. I had expected a declined transaction or a notification about insufficient funds. I had expected to be embarrassed. I did not expect to shut down a workstation. Tyler looked up at me, and his eyes were wide with genuine fear. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "I cannot touch this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is way above my pay grade. This code only comes up for the founding families or federal investigations. Who are you?" Before I could answer, he grabbed the black telephone receiver on his desk. His fingers fumbled as he dialed a 4-digit internal extension. He did not wait for a greeting. "Mrs. Robinson," he hissed into the phone, keeping his eyes locked on me as if I might pull a weapon. "You need to come to window 4, now. It is a code red." "Yes, ma'am. It is the blue card, the legacy account." The line went dead. Tyler hung up and took a step back from the counter, putting distance between himself and the piece of plastic sitting on the ledger. The silence in the bank was heavy. The other customers in line were craning their necks, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I stood tall, clutching my purse strap, trying to maintain my composure. My mind raced. Had my parents been involved in something illegal? Was this card a marker for a debt? Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the back of the branch flew open with a bang that made everyone jump. Mrs. Robinson emerged. I recognized her immediately. She had been the branch manager since I was a child, a stern woman with steel gray hair and a reputation for being unbreakable. But today she looked frantic. She was practically running across the lobby floor, her heels clicking rapidly against the tile. She ignored the line of waiting customers. She ignored the other tellers. Her gaze was fixed solely on the blue card sitting on Tyler's counter. She reached the window, breathless and flushed. She looked at the screen, seeing the red alert, and then she looked at me. Her expression softened instantly, melting from panic into something that looked like profound relief and deep sorrow. "Miss Wilson," she said, her voice breathless, "we have been waiting for this day. We have been waiting for you to walk through those doors for 10 years. Tyler tried to intervene, pointing at the screen. "Mrs. Robinson, the system is locked. I cannot void the transaction." "Get out of the way, Tyler." Mrs. Robinson commanded, her voice sharp. She reached over and plucked the card from the counter, holding it with both hands as if it were a holy relic. "This is not a transaction to be handled at a window." She turned her full attention to me, bowing her head slightly in a gesture of deference that shocked me. "Please, Miss Wilson, come with me to the private vault. We have a lot to discuss, and none of it can be said out here in the open, Mrs. Robinson dismissed the terrified teller with a sharp wave of her hand and guided me quickly into her private office. The room smelled of lemon polish and old money, a stark contrast to the sterile lobby outside. She closed the blinds, blocking out the prying eyes of the other customers, and gestured for me to sit in a burgundy leather wingback chair. She did not sit down immediately. Instead, she walked to a large steel safe embedded in the wall behind her desk. She spun the dial with practiced precision, left, right, left, until a heavy click echoed in the room. She pulled open the heavy door and retrieved a thick, dusty file folder. My name was handwritten on the tab in my father's distinct block lettering. Seeing his handwriting after all these years sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. She placed the file in front of me and finally sat down, folding her hands on the desk. She looked at me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. "Nia, you need to understand something about your parents." She began, her voice low and serious. "They were not just saving money for you. They were building a fortress. This card was never linked to a standard checking account like your sister thought. It was the physical access key to a custodial trust they established under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act back in the 90s. I stared at the file, my mouth suddenly dry. "But Ebony said there was only $2,000 in it. The letter said it was for a rainy day." Mrs. Robinson smiled, a small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "That letter was a test, Nia. And frankly, it was a decoy. Your parents knew Ebony better than anyone. They knew she would raid anything that looked like liquid cash. They knew she would sell jewelry or cars or land the moment they were gone. But they also knew she had absolutely no patience for the long game. She would never look twice at what appeared to be a boring, low-yield savings account with a minimal balance. She opened the file, revealing columns of complex financial data that spanned decades. But this was not a savings account. She continued, her finger tracing the first line of the ledger. This was a DRIP, a dividend reinvestment plan. When the account was funded, your father made a single strategic purchase. He bought 2,000 shares of a small online bookstore that was just starting to make waves, a company called Amazon. My breath hitched in my throat. The room seemed to spin. Amazon. Mrs. Robinson nodded, her eyes shining. "But here is the magic of a DRIP, Nia. Every single dime of dividend profit that stock generated over the last 20 years was automatically used to buy more stock. You did not just hold those initial shares, you accumulated. And then there were the stock splits." She turned the page to a chart that looked like a staircase climbing straight to heaven. In the late 90s, the stock split 2-for-1, then 3-for-1, then again in 99, and most recently the massive 20-for-1 split. Those original 2,000 shares multiplied exponentially, and because you never touched it, because you let it sit in the dark while you struggled and worked and scraped by the compound interest, was working harder than anyone in this building. While you were eating instant noodles, This account was generating more wealth than your sister's entire inheritance. She pushed the final page toward me. The numbers were black and bold and staggering. Your sister saw a piece of plastic worth $2,000 because she only sees the surface of things, Mrs. Robinson said softly. Your parents saw the future. They knew that one day you would be the one standing here. They wanted to make sure that when you did, you would not just have enough to survive. You would have enough to rule. The soft hum of the laser printer in the corner of the office sounded like a drum roll in the quiet room. Mrs. Robinson stood up and retrieved the single warm sheet of paper. She did not look at it. She already knew what it said. She walked back to the desk and placed the document face down in front of me, sliding it across the polished mahogany surface with a slow, deliberate movement. "Turn it over, Nia," she said softly. My hand trembled as I reached out. The paper felt heavy, as if the ink itself carried the weight of the last 20 years. I flipped it over. My eyes scanned the header, confirming the account details and the trust name. Then I let my gaze drop to the bottom right corner of the page where the total portfolio value was listed in bold black type. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, thinking surely I had misread a decimal point. But the number remained unchanged: $12,540,200.14. The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. $12 million. This was not just a safety net. This was a kingdom. This was more money than my father's entire estate had been worth on the day he died. This was more money than Ebony and Brad had ever seen in their lives. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to stifle the sob that was fighting its way out of my throat, but it was useless. The tears came hot and fast, spilling over my cheeks and dripping onto my expensive suit. I was not crying because I was rich. I was crying because for 10 years I had believed the lie that I was an afterthought. I had believed that my parents left me scraps because they loved me less. Mrs. Robinson reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine. "They knew, Nia," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father sat in this exact chair a month before he passed. He told me that Ebony loved the shine of things, but she did not understand the weight of them. He said she would burn through the visible assets within a decade. He wanted to make sure that when the smoke cleared, you would be the one standing tall." A memory flashed in my mind so vivid it hurt. I was 12 years old, sitting on the floor of my father's study while he organized his coin collection. I had asked him why he kept the ugly tarnished coins in the safe while the shiny ones were on display in the cabinet. He had looked at me over his reading glasses and said something I had forgotten until this very moment. "Naya, never judge wealth by its glitter. The shiny things are for show, but the things you cannot see, the things that look dull or hidden, those are often the most precious. Real power moves in silence." I looked down at the statement again through my blurred vision. They had hidden my inheritance in plain sight, disguised as a worthless piece of plastic because they knew it was the only way to keep it safe from my sister's greed. They had trusted me to be the one who could endure the silence. They had trusted me to be the one who would eventually find the truth. I wiped my face and took a deep, shuddering breath. The feeling of shame that I had carried since the funeral, since the moment Ebony laughed at me, vanished completely. It was replaced by a profound sense of love and a terrifying new sense of power. I was not the poor relation anymore. I was the matriarch, and I had the means to set everything right. I dried my eyes with the linen handkerchief Mrs. Robinson offered me. The shock of the $12 million was settling into a cold, hard resolve. The tears of the abandoned daughter were gone, replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of a senior auditor. I looked at the statement one last time before sliding it into my purse. Then I looked up at the branch manager who had just handed me the keys to my kingdom. "Mrs. Robinson," I said, my voice steady, "you mentioned that this bank absorbed the old community trust. Does that mean you still hold the mortgage for the Buckhead estate?" Mrs. Robinson hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional training warring with her personal loyalty. But she had seen how they treated me at the funeral. She knew the injustice that had been done. She nodded slowly. "Yes, Nia. We hold the primary mortgage and the two subsequent home equity lines of credit that your sister and her husband took out against the property. Pull up their file, I commanded. It was not a request. It was an order from a client whose assets now dwarfed the branch's daily intake. Mrs. Robinson turned to her monitor and typed in a query. I stood up and walked around the desk to stand behind her. I needed to see the numbers with my own eyes. I needed to see the math of their destruction. The screen refreshed and the color palette shifted instantly. If my account was a golden staircase to heaven, theirs was a bloody slide into hell. I scanned the columns, my auditor brain processing the data faster than I could speak. It was a disaster. The account was flagged with multiple warnings: delinquency, non-sufficient funds, breach of contract. They are classified as Group 5 debt, Mrs. Robinson said quietly, pointing to the status bar. That is the final stage before legal action. Loss. They have not made a full mortgage payment in 8 months. They are just paying the interest on the interest, trying to keep the wolves at the door. I leaned in closer, reading the notes on the file. Brad had leveraged the house to the hilt. The equity my father had built over 40 years was gone, drained to pay for luxury cars, failed crypto investments, and Ebony's endless parties. The principal balance was actually higher than the original mortgage because of the penalties and the predatory refinancing terms they had accepted in desperation. Look at the credit scores, I whispered. Ebony's score was in the low 500s. Brad's was even worse, barely scraping the 400s. They were toxic. No reputable lender would touch them. They were drowning and the water was already over their heads. Then I saw it. The notification that made my heart race, not with fear, but with the thrill of the hunt. A digital stamp in the corner of the screen read, "Pre-foreclosure proceedings initiated. Auction date set. They have 30 days," Mrs. Robinson confirmed, following my gaze. "We sent the notice of default last week. If they do not come up with the full arrears plus legal fees by the end of the month, the bank seizes the property. We will auction it off to recoup our losses." I straightened up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where my sensible sedan was parked next to a luxury SUV. I thought about Brad's arrogance at the supermarket. I thought about Ebony's fake life on Instagram. They were living in a house of cards that was already on fire, and they were too busy posing for pictures to smell the smoke. "Do not list it publicly yet," I said, turning back to Mrs. Robinson. She looked confused. "I have to follow protocol, Nia. The bank needs to recover the asset." "The bank will get its money," I assured her, a cold smile playing on my lips. "I am going to buy the debt. I do not want to just bid on the house, Mrs. Robinson. I want to own the paper. I want to be the one who decides when the gavel falls. Initiate the transfer. I am taking over the mortgage. I am going to be their new landlord, and they are not going to know until I am standing on their doorstep." I sat in the plush leather chair of Mrs. Robinson's office and watched as the printer spit out the formation documents for my new company. I decided to call it Blue Rain Holdings. It was a subtle nod to the blue debit card and the rainy day fund my parents had left me, but to the outside world, it was just another faceless corporate entity. To Brad and Ebony, it would be the invisible monster that was coming to swallow them whole. Mrs. Robinson slid the paperwork across the desk along with a pen. Her hand hovered over the signature line for a moment. "Nia, are you sure you want to do it this way?" she asked. Her brow furrowed with concern. "The bank can handle the foreclosure. We have a legal team that does this every day. You do not have to get your hands dirty. You can just buy the house at the public auction next month and be done with it." I picked up the pen and looked at the black ink shining on the tip. I shook my head slowly. If the bank forecloses, it is just bureaucracy. It is a faceless institution taking back an asset. They will blame the economy. They will blame bad luck. They will never have to look into the eyes of the person they wronged. I signed my name on the dotted line, my signature sweeping and aggressive. "I want to own the debt, Mrs. Robinson. I want to be the one who holds the note. When the sheriff knocks on that door, I want them to know that it was not a computer algorithm that evicted them. I want them to know it was me." I authorized the wire transfer. $2.4 million moved from my new trust account into the bank's general ledger. It was a staggering amount of money to spend in 10 seconds, but I did not flinch. I was not buying a house. I was buying justice. Mrs. Robinson typed the final command into her terminal. It is done, she said, leaning back in her chair. Blue Rain Holdings is now the primary lien holder on the Buckhead estate. You effectively own the mortgage. As of this moment, they are not paying the bank. They are paying you, or rather, they are failing to pay you. I picked up the file containing the mortgage deed. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than the debit card had ever felt. This was leverage. This was control. For 10 years, Brad had walked around with his chest puffed out, acting like the king of the castle. He had treated me like a peasant begging at the gate. Now I owned the gate. I owned the walls. I owned the very ground he stood on. I stood up and smoothed the front of my suit. Send the notice, I told Mrs. Robinson, but do not use my name. Send it from Blue Rain Holdings. Give them the standard legal demand. Tell them the new note holder is accelerating the debt. Demand full payment of the arrears and the principal balance within 30 days or face immediate eviction. I walked out of the bank into the bright Atlanta sunshine. The humidity usually felt oppressive, but today the air felt crisp. I checked my phone. I had 30 days to prepare for the final showdown. 30 days to let them sweat. 30 days to watch them scramble like rats on a sinking ship before I finally stepped onto the bridge and revealed who was really captain. The silence in the mansion was heavier than the darkness. For 3 days, the crystal chandeliers had hung uselessly from the vaulted ceilings, transforming the 10,000-square-foot estate into a cavernous echo chamber. Georgia Power did not care about the Wilson family name or their social standing in Buckhead. They only cared that the bill was 6 months overdue and unpaid. Now the only light in the grand living room came from a cluster of half-melted vanilla-scented candles scattered across the dining table, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the silk wallpaper like ghosts. Ebony sat huddled at the table, wrapped in a cashmere blanket that could no longer protect her from the creeping chill of the unheated house. She was hunching over her phone, the screen brightness dimmed to the lowest setting to preserve the last 7% of battery life. She was not scrolling through Instagram. She was not posting selfies. She was frantically typing on a luxury resale app, haggling with a stranger named Shopgirl99. Just take the offer, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with hunger and humiliation. Please, just take it. She was selling a limited edition Fendi Clutch, a bag she had once flaunted at charity galas, for $400. It was worth $3,000, but she needed cash immediately. The refrigerator was warm, and the smell of spoiling food from the freezer was beginning to seep into the hallway. She needed money for a pizza. She needed money for water. She tapped accept on the lowball offer and felt a tear slide down her cheek. The front door slammed open, startling her. Brad stumbled into the foyer, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the marble floor. He smelled of cheap whiskey and stale sweat. He had spent the entire day driving around Atlanta trying to borrow money from old college friends who had stopped taking his calls weeks ago. Why is it so dark in here? Brad slurred, kicking a decorative vase that sat near the entrance. It shattered loudly, but he did not even look down. Did you pay the bill, Ebony? I told you to pay the power bill with the money from the diamond bracelet. I used that money to pay the water bill. You idiot, Ebony snapped, standing up and clutching her phone like a shield. Unless you wanted us to die of thirst in the dark. We have no water, Brad. We have no food. And now we have no power. Do not call me an idiot, Brad growled, stepping into the candlelight. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I am the only one trying to fix this. I am out there every day hustling, trying to find an investor while you sit here selling our assets for pennies on the dollar. You are bleeding us dry, Ebony. Hustling Ebony let out a shrill laugh that bordered on hysteria. You call losing our life savings on fake internet coins hustling? You ruined us, Brad. You drove this family into the ground. My father knew it. Nia knew it. You are not a businessman. You are a parasite. You are a joke. The word hung in the stagnant air. Joke. It broke something inside him. The last shred of his fragile ego snapped under the weight of her truth. Brad moved faster than thought. His hand lashed out in a violent arc. The sound of flesh striking flesh echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. Ebony stumbled back, clutching her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. She collided with the sideboard, knocking over a silver tray that clattered to the floor. She did not scream. She just stared at him, the red mark already forming on her skin. Brad stood there, breathing heavily, his hands stinging, looking at what he had done. The candle on the table flickered violently in the draft, threatening to go out and leave them in total absolute darkness. They were not just broke anymore. They were broken, and they had no idea that the real storm had not even hit them yet. The morning sun did nothing to warm the icy tension inside the mansion. It only served to illuminate the dust gathering on the marble floors and the bruises forming on Ebony's cheek. The silence was broken by a sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. It was not the polite rap of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the heavy, insistent pounding of the law. Brad stumbled to the door, shielding his hungover eyes from the light. A process server stood on the porch, a large man in a cheap suit holding a thick manila envelope. He did not ask how Brad was doing. He simply verified the name, shoved the packet into Brad's chest, and walked away without looking back. Brad ripped the envelope open right there in the foyer. The papers inside were stiff and cold. At the top in bold, aggressive lettering were the words, "Notice of acceleration and intent to foreclose." He scanned the legal jargon, his heart hammering against his ribs. The plaintiff was listed as Blue Rain Holdings, LLC. The name meant nothing to him, but the numbers screamed. The new note holder was demanding immediate payment of the full principal plus all accrued interest and legal fees. The total was $2,400,000. The deadline was 30 days. Ebony snatched the paper from his trembling hands. She read the bottom line and let out a strangled cry. 30 days, she gasped, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor. "We have 30 days to find $2 million, or the sheriff throws us on the street. Who is Blue Rain Holdings? Why are they doing this so fast?" Brad did not answer. He was already pacing the hallway, his mind racing through the few terrible options he had left. He had burned every bridge with the banks. He had tapped out every friend and family member. There was only one door left to knock on, and it was a door that usually led to broken kneecaps. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had saved under the name Plumber. He walked out onto the terrace, away from Ebony's sobbing. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. It is Brad Wilson," he said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Look, I need a bridge loan, a big one, just for 30 days. I have a guaranteed flip coming through on a commercial property downtown. I just need to clear a liquidity hurdle." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavy with threat. Then the voice laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Brad Wilson," the voice said. "The guy who owes everybody in town. Word on the street is you are radioactive, Brad. Your own bank sold your debt to a shell company just to get you off their books. You think I do not have sources?" "Please," Brad begged, gripping the stone railing of the balcony until his knuckles turned white. "I will give you the deed to the Hamptons house. I will sign over the cars. I just need the cash to stop a foreclosure. I will pay you double in 2 months." The voice turned cold. "You do not own the Hamptons house anymore, Brad. The tax man put a lien on that last week. And your cars are leased. You have nothing to trade. You are a drowning man trying to pull me under with you. Do not call this number again. If you do, I will send someone over to remind you of your manners." The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in his ear, a flat, monotonous sound that signaled the end of the line. Brad lowered the phone slowly. He looked out at the overgrown lawn and the empty pool. For the first time, he realized that the game was not just rigged. It was over. The sharks had smelled the blood in the water and turned away because there was not enough meat left on his bones to be worth the bite. The fluorescent lights of the Fulton County auction hall hummed with a low, nauseating buzz that seemed to vibrate directly against Brad's skull. The room was filled with sharks. Real estate flippers in tracksuits, aggressive developers with Bluetooth headsets, and bargain hunters, looking for tragedy to turn into profit. Brad stood in the back, sweating through his shirt despite the powerful air conditioning. He was holding on to a shred of delusion. In his mind, the mansion was still the crown jewel of Buckhead. He calculated that if a bidding war started, the sale price could reach $5 million. That would pay off the hostile debt to Blue Rain Holdings and leave him with $2 million to start over. It was his last Hail Mary. The auctioneer, a man who spoke with the speed and empathy of a machine, stepped up to the podium. He rattled off the legal description of the property. Lot 402, the Wilson Estate. Foreclosure initiated by the primary lien holder, Blue Rain Holdings. Brad held his breath, praying for the first hand to go up. He needed momentum. He needed greed to take over the room. Opening bid, the auctioneer barked. Do I hear $3 million? The property is appraised at $5. $3 million is a steal. Silence. The room was dead. The developers looked at their phones. The flippers stared at the floor. Brad felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Why were they not bidding? This was prime real estate. Then a man in the front row stood up. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked sharper than anything else in the room, and he held a leather briefcase with the stillness of a statue. This was Mr. Sterling Nia's personal proxy, though Brad did not know it. Sterling turned slowly, scanning the room with cold, reptilian eyes. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked directly at the other potential bidders, silently daring them to intervene. $1 million, Sterling said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a knife. The auctioneer frowned. We have an opening bid of $1 million. That is well below the reserve, but we have a motion. Do I hear 1.5? Brad wanted to scream. $1 million was an insult. It would leave him destitute, still owing money on the debt. He looked around frantically. Come on, he whispered. Someone bid. A developer in a blue polo shirt raised his paddle. 1.2. Sterling did not hesitate. He did not even look at the developer. 2.4 million, he stated flatly. A murmur went through the crowd. That was the exact amount of the debt. Sterling was signaling to everyone in the room that he was representing the creditor. He was telling them that Blue Rain Holdings was willing to use their entire credit line to take the property back. It was a defensive move known as a credit bid. For any other buyer to win, they would have to pay cash above that amount. The developer in the blue shirt did the math. He knew he would be fighting a losing battle against a creditor who wanted the asset. He lowered his paddle and shook his head. Do I hear 2.5? The auctioneer asked, scanning the room. Going once. Brad pushed forward, his desperation making him reckless. It is worth $5 million, he shouted, his voice cracking. Do not let it go for this. The auctioneer banged the gavel. Sold to the bidder in the front row for $2.4 million. The sound of the wood striking the podium was the sound of Brad's life ending. The sale price exactly covered the debt. There was no surplus. There was no equity check coming to save him. The house was gone, and he was walking away with absolutely nothing. Sterling signed the paperwork with a gold fountain pen, snapped his briefcase shut, and walked past Brad without even acknowledging his existence. Brad stood alone in the thinning crowd, realizing he had just watched his entire future be sold for scrap parts. The late afternoon sun cast long, melancholy shadows across the empty living room of the Buckhead estate. The furniture was gone, repossessed by creditors, or sold for cash, leaving only outlines on the carpets where the sofas and cabinets had stood for decades. The air smelled of dust and stale anxiety. Brad and Ebony sat on two folding chairs they had salvaged from the garage, placed awkwardly in the center of the cavernous room. They looked like actors on a stage waiting for the curtain to rise on a tragedy. Brad was wearing his best suit, though it hung loosely on his frame now, due to the stress-induced weight loss of the last month. He adjusted his tie for the 10th time, his hands shaking slightly. He was rehearsing his speech, muttering under his breath, trying to summon the arrogance that had carried him through life up until this point. He turned to Ebony, who was staring blankly at the fireplace, nervously twisting her wedding ring. Listen to me, he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. When the new owner walks through that door, let me do the talking. I know how these corporate types operate. They do not want the hassle of finding new tenants or dealing with maintenance. They want passive income. He stood up and began to pace the floor, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood. I am going to pitch him a deal. We offer to stay on as property managers. We know the house better than anyone. We can offer him security and upkeep in exchange for letting us stay in the guest wing until we get back on our feet. I will flatter him. I will tell him he made a brilliant acquisition. Rich people love being sucked up to. They love feeling like the smartest person in the room. If I stroke his ego enough, he might even give us a stipend. Ebony looked up at him, her eyes hollow. You really think that will work? She asked quietly. You think a stranger who just paid millions for this house is going to let the previous owners live in the basement like servants? It is our only play, Brad snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. Unless you want to sleep in a shelter tonight, you better put on your best smile and agree with everything I say. We have to charm him, Ebony. We have to make him pity us just enough to let us stay but respect us enough to think we are useful. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside froze them both. It was the heavy, distinct hum of a luxury engine. Brad rushed to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. He is here, Brad whispered, rushing back to his spot. Stand up, Ebony. Look presentable. Do not look desperate. Look like we are temporarily inconvenienced aristocrats. They stood side by side in the center of the room, a portrait of fallen grace. The heavy oak front door groaned. The sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the foyer. It was a sound that signaled the end of their reign. Brad pasted a wide, sycophantic smile onto his face, extending his hand toward the hallway, ready to greet the savior he hoped to manipulate. He prepared his opening line, ready to charm the wealthy stranger who had bought their debt. He watched the door handle turn, expecting a middle-aged man in a suit, or perhaps a banker. He took a breath, ready to perform the greatest act of his life, never suspecting that the person on the other side of that door was immune to his charm because she had spent a lifetime memorizing his cruelty. The heavy front door swung open, pushing a rectangle of blinding white sunlight into the gloomy, dust-filled foyer. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop instantly, sucking the oxygen out of the space. Brad froze, his hand still extended in a greeting that would never be completed. He squinted against the glare, trying to make out the silhouette standing on the threshold. The first thing to cross the boundary into the house was the heel. It was a stiletto, sharp as a dagger made of black patent leather. As the foot came down, the sole flashed a vibrant, unmistakable red. It was a Christian Louboutin, the kind of shoe Ebony used to worship, the kind of shoe that signaled absolute, unshakable status. Click, click, click. The sound of the heels against the marble floor was slow and rhythmic. It was not the walk of a guest. It was the march of a conqueror. The figure stepped fully into the room, followed closely by a man in a gray suit. Brad's jaw went slack. The man was Mr. Vance, the family attorney who had read the will all those years ago. But he was not leading. He was following a step behind, carrying a briefcase and a sleek designer coat like a loyal attendant. The woman in the lead stopped in the center of the room. She was wearing a cream-colored tailored suit that fit her like a second skin, radiating a quiet, terrifying elegance. She reached up with a gloved hand and slowly removed her oversized dark sunglasses, revealing eyes that were cold, clear, and utterly devoid of mercy. It was Nia. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had landed but not yet detonated. Brad stood paralyzed, his brain unable to reconcile the girl he had thrown out in the rain with the woman standing before him. Ebony broke the silence with a screech that sounded like tearing metal. She scrambled up from her folding chair, knocking it over with a loud clatter. The shock on her face morphed instantly into a mask of ugly, familiar hatred. She lunged forward, her finger pointing accusingly at Nia's face. "What the hell are you doing here?" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Did you come to gloat? Did you come to watch us pack up? You have some nerve showing your face here after everything. What is the matter? Did you finally run out of that charity money? Are you here to beg for a handout from the new owner?" She laughed a manic broken sound. "Well, you are too late, Nia. We are leaving. We have nothing for you. Get out. Get back to the gutter where you belong before I call the police and have you dragged out for trespassing." Brad grabbed Ebony's arm, trying to pull her back, but his eyes were locked on Mr. Vance. He looked confused, terrified. Vance looked at the floor, refusing to meet Brad's gaze. Nia did not flinch. She did not yell back. She did not even look at Ebony. She simply handed her sunglasses to Mr. Vance, who took them with a respectful nod. She turned her head slowly, surveying the empty room, looking at the faded spots on the walls where the art used to hang. She looked at the house not with nostalgia, but with the critical, appraising eye of a landlord inspecting a damaged property. The sheer indifference of her gaze hit Ebony harder than any slap could have. Nia was not here to fight. You do not fight with insects, you simply step on them. Mr. Vance cleared his throat, a dry, authoritative sound that cut through Ebony's tirade like a judge's gavel. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the screaming woman and his client. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the couple he had served for years, with a mixture of professional detachment and pity. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a document that was stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. "I would advise you to lower your voice," Mrs. Wilson Vance said, his tone even and cold. "You are currently screaming at the only person who has the legal authority to have you removed from these premises by force. You asked if Nia was here to beg. I am afraid you have the situation entirely backward." Ebony stopped, her mouth hanging open. She looked from the lawyer to her sister, her mind struggling to process the shift in power. Brad stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Vance, what are you talking about?" Brad asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You said the house was sold to an investor. You said it was sold to Blue Rain Holdings." Mr. Vance nodded slowly. He turned slightly, gesturing to Nia with an open hand. "It is my distinct honor to introduce you to the sole proprietor of Blue Rain Holdings, the entity that purchased your distressed debt from the bank, the investor who outbid every developer in the room this morning. This is Miss Nia Wilson. She is the new owner of this estate. She is also the holder of your outstanding $2 million liability." The heir left the room. Brad looked at Nia as if she had grown a second head. He staggered back until his legs hit the edge of the folding chair and he collapsed onto it. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He looked at the girl he had mocked, the girl he had called a charity case, and suddenly the pieces of the puzzle slammed together. The suit, the shoes, the confidence. She had not just survived. She had ascended. Nia did not say a word. She walked slowly toward the small folding table where the flickering candles stood. She held a thick, heavy folder in her hand. It was the deed to the property, the ultimate proof of ownership. She looked at Ebony, who was frozen in shock, her eyes locked on the folder. A memory played in Nia's mind, sharp and vivid. She remembered standing in the study 10 years ago. She remembered Ebony holding the blue debit card, laughing at the $2,000 balance. She remembered the way Ebony had flicked her wrist, tossing the card onto the floor, forcing Nia to kneel and pick it up. Nia raised her hand, holding the folder high. She locked eyes with her sister, letting a small, cold smile touch her lips. Then she released it. The folder hit the wooden table with a loud, violent smack that echoed off the bare walls. It slid across the surface, knocking over one of the candles before coming to a rest right in front of Ebony. It was not a handoff. It was an act of aggression. It was a receipt for a debt paid in full with interest. "Read it," Nia commanded, her voice soft but filled with steel. "Go ahead, Ebony. Pick it up. See whose name is on the title. See who owns the roof over your head. You wanted me to leave, but I think you will find that under the laws of property rights, I am the only one who belongs here. You are just guests who have overstayed their welcome." The realization hit Brad like a physical blow to the stomach. He stared at the bold black letters on the deed, and then up at the woman standing above him. His brain, usually fogged by cheap whiskey and panic, suddenly snapped into a moment of crystal-clear survival instinct. He looked at Ebony, who was still staring at the table with her mouth open. She looked old. She looked broken. She looked like a liability. He made his choice in a fraction of a second. Brad lunged forward. He did not move to comfort his wife. He moved to discard her. He shoved Ebony hard against the shoulder, sending her stumbling back into the wall. She let out a gasp of pain, but he did not even glance at her. He threw himself at Nia's feet. His knees hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud that must have been painful, but he did not flinch. He reached out, grabbing the hem of her cream trousers with sweaty, trembling hands. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and wet, with a desperate, fawning adoration. "Nia, baby, listen to me," he pleaded, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic stream. "Thank God it is you. Thank God you saved the house. I knew you would do it. I told Ebony just last week that you were the only one with the brains to fix this mess. You are the genius of the family, Nia. You always were." Ebony pulled herself up from the wall, clutching her shoulder, her eyes wide with betrayal. "Brad, what are you doing?" she whispered. "Shut up, Ebony," he roared over his shoulder, not breaking eye contact with Nia. "You have done enough damage." He turned back to Nia, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, trying to create an intimacy that did not exist. "Nia, you have to believe me. It was all her. She made me do it. She made me treat you that way. You know how she is. She is jealous. She is controlling. I wanted to let you stay in the guest house back then. I wanted to give you more money, but she threatened to divorce me. She poisoned me against you." He crawled closer, his hands trying to grasp her ankles like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "We are family, Nia," he whimpered. "I always looked at you like a little sister. I defended you when Mom and Dad were hard on you. Remember, we can run this place together, just you and me. We can kick her out. She is dead weight, Nia. Just tell me what you need me to do, and I will do it. I will serve you. Just do not throw me out." Nia looked down at him. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked at him the way a sanitation worker looks at a squashed cockroach on the pavement. A mixture of mild revulsion and clinical detachment. She saw a man who had stripped himself of every last shred of dignity. He was not a villain anymore. He was not a monster. He was just a stain on the floor of her house. She slowly pulled her leg away from his grasp, as if his touch carried a contagious disease. She dusted off the fabric of her trousers with a gloved hand and took a step back, leaving him kneeling there, grasping at empty air. "You are pathetic," she said softly. Her voice was not loud, but in the empty room it sounded like a judge passing a death sentence. "You would sell your own wife for a roof over your head. You are not a victim, Brad. You are an accomplice who just ran out of luck, and I do not make deals with parasites." Nia reached into her designer purse, but she was not reaching for a checkbook. She withdrew a thick, rubber-banded stack of cash she had withdrawn specifically for this moment. It was not crisp new currency. It was a brick of worn, wrinkled $20 bills. The kind of money that circulated in the world they despised. The kind of money that smelled of sweat and hard labor. She weighed the bundle in her palm, feeling the poetic density of it. It was exactly $2,000. The exact price tag they had once put on her dignity. She looked at Ebony, who was staring at the cash with confusion, and then at Brad, who was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the debris of his own betrayal. "Do you remember what you told me 10 years ago, Ebony?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor. "You said $2,000 was a generous inheritance. You said it was enough to rent a studio apartment in the slums and buy a bus pass. You told me not to let my pride make me starve." Nia took a step closer, towering over the couple who were now united only by their absolute ruin. She broke the rubber band with a sharp snap that sounded like a bone breaking. "Well, I am returning the favor," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "I am a generous woman. I am giving you the same start you gave me. Consider this my severance package. It is exactly $2,000. It should be just enough to get you a room at that motel by the highway in East Point, the one with the flickering neon sign and the thin walls. You know the one. It is where you said I belonged. She did not hand the money to them. She tossed the stack high into the air with a violent flick of her wrist. The bills separated in the draft of the large room, raining down like a storm of green confetti. They fluttered in slow motion, landing on Brad's slumped shoulders and getting tangled in Ebony's hair. They drifted to the floor, covering the expensive hardwood in a carpet of small denominations. It was a blizzard of pity. "Pick it up," Nia commanded, echoing the exact words that had haunted her nightmares for a decade. "Go on, pick it up. You need every penny. Do not let your pride make you starve." Brad reached out instinctively, grabbing a $20 bill that had landed near his knee. Ebony watched him, her face crumbling, as the finality of their situation set in. "You have 15 minutes, Nia said, checking her diamond watch. "You can take your clothes and whatever personal items you can carry in your hands. Everything else belongs to me. The furniture, the art, the cars. It is all collateral against the debt you failed to pay. If you are not past the iron gates when the clock strikes 5, the police will be here to escort you out in handcuffs for trespassing. And trust me, I will press charges." She turned her back on them, walking toward the window to watch the sunset over her new estate. Behind her, the sound of rustling paper filled the room as her sister and her husband scrambled on their hands and knees, desperate to gather the scraps she had thrown at them. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times. The deep, resonant sound vibrated through the floorboards, signaling the absolute end of the grace period. The 15 minutes were gone. Before the final echo could fade, the heavy front door, which had been left ajar, was pushed open fully. Sheriff Miller stepped across the threshold. He was a mountain of a man with a badge that caught the dying sunlight and a face carved from granite. He was not a stranger to me. I had saved his department thousands of dollars in a budget audit 2 years ago, and he was a man who remembered his friends. He nodded to me a sharp, respectful gesture, touching the brim of his hat, before turning his steely gaze to the 2 figures scrambling on the floor. Brad was stuffing the crumpled $20 bills into his pockets like a madman. Ebony was frantically trying to zip a duffel bag that was bursting at the seams. "Time is up," Sheriff Miller announced, his voice filling the room and leaving no space for argument. "You are now trespassing on private property. You have 10 seconds to vacate the premises or you will be removed in handcuffs." Ebony let out a strangled sob. She looked around the room, her eyes darting wildly, seeking one last thing of value to take with her. She could not bear to leave empty-handed. Her gaze landed on the hallway console table, where 3 bottles of rare imported French perfume sat on a silver tray. They were worth $1,000 each. She lunged for them, her fingers curling around the crystal necks. "That is mine," she shrieked, clutching the bottles to her chest. "I bought these in Paris. You cannot take my personal items." She turned to run toward the door, but Sheriff Miller moved with deceptive speed for a man of his size. He blocked her path, his shadow engulfing her. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached out and clamped a hand over her wrist. It was not a violent grip, but it was immovable. "Drop them," he ordered. "These are mine," Ebony screamed again, hysteria rising in her throat. "Everything inside these 4 walls is listed as collateral in the foreclosure seizure," Miller stated calmly. "The furniture, the fixtures, the personal effects left on the premises after the deadline. That includes the bottles in your hand. That is the property of Ms. Wilson now. Unless you want to add a charge of grand larceny to the trespassing charge, I suggest you put them back on the table." Ebony looked at me. She wanted me to intervene. She wanted me to say it was okay to take the perfume. But I stood motionless, my face a mask of indifference. I was the statue of justice, and justice is blind to tears. Ebony's hand trembled. Her grip loosened. The crystal bottles slipped from her fingers and hit the hardwood floor. They did not break, but they clattered loudly, rolling away from her like marbles. The scent of expensive jasmine released from a cracked stopper filled the air, mixing with the smell of their fear. "Let us go," Miller said, gripping Brad by the elbow and steering Ebony with his other hand. He marched them toward the door. Brad looked back over his shoulder one last time, his eyes pleading, his mouth opening to beg, but Miller shoved him forward. They stumbled out onto the porch into the humid Atlanta evening. I watched them go. I watched them dragged down the steps, past the overgrown lawn, and through the iron gates that slammed shut behind them with a final metallic clang. They were gone. The house was silent. I was alone in the dark, but for the first time in my life I was not afraid of the shadows. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the spilled perfume and the sweet, sharp taste of victory. I was home. The heavy iron gates clicked shut with a mechanical finality that vibrated through the pavement. The sound was distinct and absolute. It was the inverse of the thunderclap that had drowned out my sobbing 10 years ago. Today, there was no rain to hide their tears. The sky was a cruel, brilliant blue, and the sun beat down on the asphalt with an indifference that felt personal. The birds were singing in the oak trees, a cheerful soundtrack to the absolute destruction of the Wilson legacy. Brad and Ebony stood on the public sidewalk, the space that separated the elite from the unwanted. They looked like refugees from a high-fashion disaster. Brad was clutching a heavy black garbage bag, filled with his bespoke suits, the thin plastic stretching and tearing against the sharp edges of the hangers. Ebony was holding her silk duvet, bunched up in her arms, dragging it through the dirt and pollen on the ground. The $2,000 in crumpled bills was stuffed into Brad's pocket, a lump that ruined the line of his trousers. The shock of the eviction wore off quickly, replaced by the venom of two people who had nothing left to lose but their anger. Brad turned on his wife. His face was purple with heat and rage, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. "Are you happy now, Ebony?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Is this the lifestyle you wanted? We are homeless. We are standing on the curb like trash because you needed that infinity pool. You needed the parties. You needed to look rich so badly that you made us poor." Ebony dropped the duvet into the dust. She stepped forward, her eyes wild. "Do not dare blame this on me, you spineless coward. You were the man of the house. You were supposed to fix it. Instead, you gambled our future away on magic internet money and begged my sister for scraps on your knees. I saw you, Brad. I saw you crawling like a dog. You make me sick." She shoved him hard in the chest. Brad stumbled back, tripping over a bag of shoes. He caught himself and looked ready to strike her again, but he froze. Across the street, Mrs. Gable, who used to drink mimosas with Ebony on the patio every Sunday, was standing by her mailbox. She was not coming over to offer a guest room. She was not calling a moving van. She was holding her iPhone horizontally, steadily filming the entire breakdown. Two joggers slowed down, pulling out their own devices. A landscaping crew paused their leaf blowers to watch the show. The red recording dots were all blinking. Ebony realized with a jolt of horror that this was not a private tragedy. This was content. By tonight, the video of the Wilsons screaming at each other on the sidewalk surrounded by garbage bags would be viral in every social circle in Atlanta. The caption would not be about tragedy. It would be about karma. Ebony screamed at Mrs. Gable to stop, but the woman just zoomed in, capturing the desperation in high definition. "Stop it," Brad hissed, grabbing Ebony's arm and dragging her away from the lens. "You are making it worse. We are already a joke, Ebony. Do not become a meme." He hoisted the garbage bag over his shoulder, the plastic digging into his skin. "Come on. The bus stop is a mile away, and these bags are not getting any lighter." Ebony looked back at the house one last time. She saw the curtain in the master bedroom move just slightly. She knew I was watching. She grabbed her dirty duvet and turned away, following her broken husband down the hill while the neighbors kept filming, documenting every step of their long walk into oblivion. The lock clicked shut, sealing out the heat and the noise of the outside world. For a long time, I just stood there with my back against the heavy wood door, listening to the house settle. The silence was different now. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of a battlefield where enemies were sleeping in the next room. It was a clean, expansive silence. It was the sound of a lung finally filling with air after being underwater for a decade. I kicked off my expensive heels, leaving them by the stairs, and walked barefoot across the cool marble. My toes gripped the floor, grounding me. I walked through the foyer and into the great hall. I looked at the walls. Ebony had tried so hard to erase our parents. She had covered the timeless elegance of the original design with her own desperate need for validation. The walls were plastered in a gaudy metallic wallpaper, a shimmering gold damask that looked cheap despite its price tag. It screamed for attention just like she did. I walked up to the main wall near the fireplace. I ran my hand over the textured surface, feeling the artificial grit of the glitter embedded in the paper. It felt foreign. It felt like a lie. I found a small seam near the wainscoting where the glue had started to peel, likely from the humidity of the house, sitting without power for weeks. I dug my fingernail under the edge. I pulled. The paper resisted for a moment, holding onto the plaster with a stubborn grip. Then, with a loud, satisfying rip, a long strip tore away. It curled down like the skin of a shedding snake. I pulled harder, using both hands, now my grip firm and purposeful. A massive sheet of the gold foil came away in a single piece, crashing to the floor in a heap of dust and dried glue. I stepped back to look at what was underneath. There it was, the soft sage green paint. It was faded slightly, and there were a few nail holes from where the old family portraits used to hang, but it was still there. It was the color my mother had chosen the year I turned 10. She said it was a color that meant growth, a color that meant life. Ebony had tried to cover it up. She had tried to bury it under layers of flash and noise, but the foundation had remained. It had been waiting for me all this time, protected by the very layers intended to hide it. I walked along the length of the wall, tearing down strip after strip. The sound of the ripping paper was rhythmic and hypnotic. With every piece that fell to the floor, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The anger that had fueled me for so long, the hot, burning need for retribution, began to evaporate. It was replaced by a cool, steady sense of calm. I was not tearing down the wallpaper to hurt Ebony. She was gone. She did not matter anymore. I was doing this for me. I was reclaiming the space. I was stripping away the trauma and the pretense to get back to the truth. By the time I finished one wall, the floor was littered with gold scraps. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the debris, breathing hard. I looked at the patch of sage green paint illuminated by the last rays of the sun coming through the window. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I just closed my eyes and let the peace wash over me. The war was over. The house was mine, and for the first time in 10 years I was truly home. Justice is often slow, but when it arrives, it strikes with the weight of a sledgehammer. Brad found out the hard way that you cannot leverage assets you do not own, and you cannot fabricate collateral for federal loans. The SEC investigation that started the week after the eviction was swift and brutal. They found the forged signatures on the loan documents. They found the shell companies used to hide the losses. They found the Ponzi scheme he had been running with his friends' investment money. The judge called him a predator. The courtroom was packed, not with supporters, but with the victims he had scammed. Brad stood in an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his pale complexion and listened as the gavel sealed his fate. 8 years in a federal penitentiary. No parole. He was led away in handcuffs, his wrists chafed by the metal, his head hanging low. He had traded the master suite of a Buckhead mansion for a 6x8 concrete cell. He had traded his freedom for a gamble that never paid off. Now he spends his days scrubbing floors for 12 cents an hour, realizing that he finally has a steady job for the first time in his life. Across town, the air did not smell of prison disinfectant. It smelled of stale, grease-burnt onions and despair. Ebony stood behind the counter of the Burger Barn, a roadside fast food joint that had a failing health score and a sticky floor. She was wearing a polyester uniform, 2 sizes too big for her, and a hairnet that dug into her scalp. Her hands, which used to be adorned with diamond rings and French manicures, were now red and chapped from the industrial sanitizer. She was not the manager. She was not even a cashier. She was the cleanup crew. "Hey you!" the shift supervisor yelled, snapping his fingers. "Table 4. Kid threw up a milkshake. Go handle it." Ebony flinched. The supervisor was 19 years old with acne scars and a power trip. A year ago, she would have had him fired for looking at her the wrong way. Today, she just nodded, keeping her eyes on the linoleum. "Yes, sir." She grabbed the mop bucket and the gray rag that smelled like mildew. She walked to table 4, kneeling on the hard tiles to wipe up the sticky pink mess. The customers ignored her. To them, she was invisible. She was just part of the furniture, a fixture of their convenience. Above the counter, a flat-screen television was playing the midday news. Usually it was just background noise, but a familiar name cut through the din of the fryers. We are here live with Atlanta's newest philanthropist and CEO of Blue Rain Holdings, Ms. Nia Wilson. Ebony froze. Her hand stopped moving mid-scrub. She looked up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. There she was. Nia was sitting in a high-rise studio bathed in professional lighting. She looked radiant. She was wearing a sage green blazer that matched the paint in their old living room. She spoke with a calm authority, discussing her new initiative to provide financial literacy and housing for at-risk youth. She was not just rich. She was beloved. She was building a legacy while Ebony was cleaning up vomit. "Hey, lady, move it," a customer grunted, kicking the leg of the chair near Ebony's head. "I am trying to eat here." Ebony looked back at the screen. Nia was smiling. It was a smile of genuine peace, a smile of someone who had won the only war that mattered. Ebony looked down at the dirty rag in her hand. A single tear dripped from her nose and mixed with the gray water in the bucket. She scrubbed the floor harder, trying to erase the image, trying to scrub away the reality of what she had become, but the stain was too deep. She was on her knees, exactly where she belonged, while her sister was touching the sky. The iron gates of the cemetery were open, welcoming the long shadows of the late afternoon. It was the golden hour, that brief fleeting window of time, when the harsh light of the day softened into something warm and forgiving. I parked my car on the gravel path and walked up the gentle hill toward the family plot. The grass was thick and green beneath my feet, a stark contrast to the scorched earth I had left behind at the eviction. I carried a bouquet of white lilies, simple, elegant, unpretentious. They were my mother's favorite. I reached the double headstone. It was made of gray granite, solid and unyielding, just like my father had been. Moss had begun to creep into the etched letters of their names. I knelt down, not minding the dirt staining the knees of my trousers. I reached out and brushed the moss away, tracing the dates of their birth and their death. For 10 years coming here had been painful. I had come here to cry, to ask why they had left me with nothing, why they had left me to be wolves. Today, I came with dry eyes and a heart full of understanding. I placed the flowers in the stone vase. The wind rustled the oak trees overhead, a sound like a collective exhale from the earth itself. "You knew," I said aloud, my voice steady in the quiet air. "You knew exactly what would happen." I sat back on my heels, looking at the stone as if I could see them standing there. "I was so angry at you for so long. I thought that blue debit card was a cruel joke. I thought you looked at me and saw a failure, someone who only deserved the leftovers. But I see the board now. I see the game you were playing. You knew Ebony was a fire that would consume everything in her path. If you had given me the money, then she would have found a way to take it, or I would have been too weak to protect it. You had to hide it. You had to bury the treasure deep so that only the person willing to dig through the dirt could find it." I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the key to the house they built, the house I saved. "You gave me the greatest gift of all," I continued. "You gave me the struggle. You let me be hungry so I would learn how to hunt. You let me be cold so I would learn how to build a fire. You forced me to become strong because you knew that wealth without strength is just a tragedy waiting to happen. Ebony got the glitter and look where it got her. She chased the appearance of wealth and lost the substance of it. I stood up, brushing the grass from my clothes. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I felt a profound connection to the two people lying beneath the earth. They had played a 20-year gamble on my character, and I had finally cashed out. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. Thank you for teaching me the lesson about real value. You taught me that the most precious things are often heavy and dull and hidden in plain sight. You taught me that not everything that glitters is gold. I touched the top of the headstone one last time, a silent promise to keep the legacy safe. I turned and walked back toward the car. The wind was at my back, pushing me forward. I did not look back at the graves. I did not need to. They were not behind me anymore. They were part of me, living in the steel of my spine and the wisdom in my blood. The sun had set on the past. Tomorrow the sun would rise on my empire. The timeline shifts. The graveyard fades into the soft focus of memory. I am back in the room where it all began, but the air is different now. The smell of fear and stale perfume is gone, replaced by the scent of burning oak and fresh rain coming through the open terrace doors. I am sitting on the vintage leather sofa, my legs crossed, my posture relaxed. This is no longer a battlefield. It is a sanctuary. On the coffee table in front of me sits a small, simple frame. Inside, it is not a picture of a family vacation or a wedding. It is the blue debit card. The plastic is faded and the magnetic strip is scratched, but to me it is the most beautiful piece of art in the house. It is a monument to survival. I lean forward and pick it up. The glass is cool against my skin. They thought this was trash, I say, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. They thought $2,000 was an insult, a crumb to be brushed off the table. But they forgot the most basic rule of economics. Value is not determined by the number on the bill. It is determined by what you build with it. I did not keep that money. I did not buy a purse or a pair of shoes to prove I was better than them. I took that exact amount, those crumpled bills I threw at their feet, and I opened a new account. I called it the Rainy Day Fund. But this time, it was not for me. I turned it into a seed. I invested it. I grew it. And today, that initial $2,000 has blossomed into the Blue Rain Scholarship Foundation. We fully fund the college education of 50 students every single year. But we do not just pick the students with the best grades or the perfect attendance records. We look for the others. We look for the kids in the back of the room wearing clothes that do not fit. We look for the ones who stay at school late because they do not want to go home. We look for the ones who have been told by their own families that they are mistakes, that they are burdens, that they are worth nothing more than a bus ticket out of town. I find them and I give them the key that was denied to me. I tell them that their worth is not defined by who loves them or who leaves them. I tell them that being abandoned does not mean you are garbage. It means you are free to build your own family. You are free to write your own name. I look at the camera, my gaze steady and direct. I know the coldness of that rain. I know the hollow ache of the word goodbye. I know what it feels like to stand outside the gate and watch the lights go out in the only home you have ever known. No child should ever have to feel that cold again. As long as I am standing inside this house, I will make sure the gate stays open for them. That is the real inheritance. That is the real victory. Not the money, not the house, but the ability to turn a tragedy into a ladder for someone else to climb. The evening light has finally surrendered to the soft glow of the lamps in the great hall. I am standing by the window holding a glass of that vintage Cabernet, the same label I bought on the day I first decided to stop being a victim. The liquid is deep and red, catching the light like a gemstone. It tastes of oak and berries and thyme. It tastes like patience. I look at the reflection in the glass. I do not see the scared girl who stood in the rain anymore. I see a survivor. I see a woman who took the bricks thrown at her and used them to build a fortress. Life has a funny way of packaging its gifts. Sometimes a blessing looks like a disaster. Sometimes an inheritance looks like an insult. My sister saw a blue piece of plastic and saw poverty. She saw a limit. She saw $2,000 and she laughed because she could not imagine a world where value existed beneath the surface. She was so busy looking for the shine that she missed the substance. That is the mistake so many people make. They judge the book by its cover. They judge the account by the card. They let the world tell them what they are worth based on the clothes on their back or the car in their driveway. But here's the truth I want you to carry with you. If someone throws you a charity card, do not let your pride make you throw it back. Do not let your anger blind you to the opportunity. Pick it up. Wipe off the dirt. Check the balance. Because sometimes the smallest keys open the biggest doors. And even if the balance is zero, even if the card is truly empty, that is not the end of the story. The card is just a tool. You are the asset. The real wealth was never in the bank. It was in the long nights of studying when my friends were partying. It was in the silence of my small apartment where I learned to be comfortable with my own thoughts. It was in the discipline of saving every penny while others were spending money they did not have. You have to be willing to be underestimated. You have to be willing to let them laugh at you. Let them think you are poor. Let them think you are weak. Let them think you are finished. While they are busy making noise, you will be busy making moves. While they are chasing the spotlight, you will be owning the power grid. Increase your own value. Sharpen your mind until it cuts like a diamond. Build your character until it is harder than steel. That is the only currency that never devalues. That is the only investment that no market crash can ever take away from you. I lift the glass toward the empty room, saluting the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future. I salute the struggle that made me who I am. Here is to the rainy days. Here is to the blue cards. And here is to the ones who are smart enough to keep them. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. The taste is perfect. I set the glass down on the table right next to the deed of the house. I look into the camera one last time, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. The silence of the room is replaced by the smooth, low hum of a saxophone. The jazz swells, filling the space with a rhythm that feels like a heartbeat. The world is quiet. The work is done. True wealth is quiet, while debt is loud. Nia's journey teaches us that patience and financial literacy are the ultimate equalizers. While Brad and Ebony focused on the appearance of status, Nia focused on the substance of growth. She proved that being underestimated is actually a strategic advantage. Never let your pride make you reject a humble beginning, and never let immediate gratification destroy your long-term future. The most valuable assets are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the discipline to uncover them. If you believe in building real value over fake status, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories where the underdog takes it all.